Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it's time for another series review, and this is going to be a mini-series. It will be my review of the Shining miniseries that was produced and released in the 90s. Now, unlike the first one, Stephen King was heavily involved with this one. He actually wrote the teleplay, and he actually had a cameo appearance as a band conductor, and I believe the last episode. Now, this miniseries is directed by Mick Garris, who, of course, wrote and directed Critters 2, directed an episode of Freddy's Nightmare, directed Psycho 4, and also directed the Stand miniseries that they made in the 90s. So, nice little bit of continuity there. Stand miniseries, another one I want to revisit one of these days. Probably after I get around to reading the novel, but that's, down the road. Now, this miniseries stars Steven Weber as Jack Torrance. It's Rebecca De Mornay as his wife Winifred, Cortland Mead as their son Daniel, Melvin Van Peebles as Dick Halloran, and in a small role we got the man who reminds me of my grandfather, Pat Hingle, as Watson. There's other actors, but I'll bring them up as it goes around, as you can probably tell up there. Like a lot of the other times when I start reviewing a series other than my Raymond reviews, this is going to be an overview where I'm going to give some of my thoughts about the series, some of the behind the scenes stuff, before delving into actually reviewing the episodes proper. Now, in order to properly delve into this and why this even exists, we have to go back in time to the late 70s, early 80s, when Stanley Kubrick optioned and directed the classic film from that era. Now, King in the years has made no bones about not liking that series, and even some of my fellow hardcore constant readers will have to admit that it is not the most faithful adaptation of King's work. It does a pretty good job adapting elements of the story, but if there's one big element that it really does bastardize, it is the character of Jack Torrance and his slow descent down back into alcoholism, pushed and spurred on by the spirits that inhabit the Overlook Hotel. In Kubrick's film, it seems like Jack is just a little kooky from the start, and the hotel just added a little hot sauce to it. And then, of course, with how Kubrick shoots certain scenes, there's always the whole thing that maybe some of it is all in his head, and then the Overlook is there too. It's one of those weird things, like when he's talking to the ghost through the door and you only hear the voice, you don't see it. There's stuff like that. And, of course, Kubrick talking with King at all hours of the night, asking him weird questions. Do you believe in God? There's a lot of weird stuff you could talk about when it comes to the production of that film. And even nowadays, some people don't like it, some people do enjoy it. I fall into the camp I do enjoy it, but it is iconic to the point that there's parodies like the Simpson one. No TV and no beer make Homer something something go crazy. Don't mind if I do! That whole thing. Now, King, of course, being the author and the fact that he put a lot of his then experiences in it, you can understand why he hated that they bastardized it. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by he put a lot into it, there's the obvious things that King always has a proclivity for having characters be writers. You can read how much of a self-insert that is however you want, but a lot of his stories do have it. Dark Half, one of the characters, is a writer. Of course, one of the characters in it is a writer. I believe there's a writer somewhere in The Stand. Then, of course, Misery, which I'll bring up in a second. The main character is a writer. And, of course, here, Jack Torrance is a writer. But he's not only a writer, he's a writer struggling with alcoholism. And from the mid-70s, when King's mother passed away, and even the story I probably never mentioned about him actually giving her eulogy while drunk, which is a sad sight to imagine, until a little bit after the Shining miniseries came out, King was dealing with addiction problems. Not only alcohol, but drugs. And it got to the point where a couple of his works he doesn't really remember that much. Like Cujo, he doesn't even remember writing it. And that's saying something, because that's a very short work, and it's a pretty good one. And in there, King spotlessly recreates a unique George Carlin comedy thing. Like, in the universe of King's work, I can imagine Carlin, if he existed, doing a little joke about this, involving, nothing wrong here. When I'm reading it, especially since I was heavily into George Carlin when I was reading that book the first time, I'm like, oh my god, this is spot on. I can easily picture early 80s George Carlin doing that. So that's saying something, that he could write that spot on, but he doesn't remember it. And of course, shortly after they published Cujo, King's family and friends staged an intervention where they dumped in front of him evidence of all of his addictions that they pulled from his office. Beer cans, cigarette butts, cocaine, Xanax, Valium, NyQuil, Robitussin, other types of stuff that they could find in there that he could use. And of course, he did eventually seek help, and he became sober. And it was by the late 80s that he was stone cold sober. Now, with that, of course, there's going to be some struggle. And this is one thing that he mentioned that I did not know, but when you think about it, you're like, that in addition to one of the plagiarism accusations that he dealt with, his whole struggle with addiction is one of his inspirations for the character of Annie Wilkes in Misery. Remember, the number one fan doesn't want to let him go? You can see it as a whole allegory for his drug addiction, in the same way that Annie Wilkes is Paul Sheldon's number one fan and doesn't want to let him go, or the series that he's writing go, which there's also the whole thing about over-obsessed fans in there. In that same way, you could say that addiction is like your number one fan and doesn't want you to go. Like, yeah, come on, King, you don't want to go. Just have one more beer. It's going to be fun. Stuff like that. So much you can read into it. You could do a whole essay on it, but that's not in this video. Well, he got clean, and combined with him not really liking the Kubrick one, because, like I mentioned, cut out all that, and since he was dealing with a lot of the same struggles at the time, you can kind of see why he'd have that little thing. Now, in the years since this miniseries has come out, he's kind of softened his stance on it a bit. I mean, he freaking let the people that made the film adaptation of his sequel to The Shining, Doctor Sleep, make it not only as a adaptation of the book, but a sequel to Kubrick's film, which that was the biggest surprise when I saw it. I'm like, really? Is this a sequel to Kubrick's film? Dang. Which, that's the biggest thing, and he said that kind of made him appreciate Kubrick's a little bit more. And with that, I'll say I do like that they pulled a little bit more of the book verse into the Kubrick verse with it retroactively, but they still succeeded there nonetheless. Now, this being past the golden age of King adaptations, which for me is the 80s into the early 90s, because, like I mentioned, The Shining, and we had Cat's Eye, both creep show films, even though I think there's only like one or two parts that involve King adaptations in there. Cujo, Pet Sematary, all the ones you really think of when you think of Stephen King adaptations. Early 90s, you had the miniseries like It, of course, The Stand. Around this time we still had other ones, but this is where they were doing more of the miniseries than they were the adaptations. There were some, but most of what I could think of from this period were other miniseries. Desperation, Storm of the Century, Rose Red, very atmospheric one that I want to revisit. So it makes sense that they would do it. And of course, like I mentioned, King wrote the teleplay. Garris was the director. And they filmed it on location at the Stanley Hotel, which was King's inspiration for the Overlook, as he stayed there at night when they were closing for the season. And it's one of those things that when you're at a place and you get like a certain picture and a vibe from a place, it starts to stay with you. And being a creative person, got the King's wheels rolling, and there we went. And of course, he also stayed in room 217, which is said to be haunted. Now, as I've mentioned, I've been inside a building out here in the area I live at. It is supposedly haunted, and while I've never seen anything, I did get a weird vibe. And when I went to Chicago a couple years ago, I did go to the Congress Hotel. While I didn't step inside, just being nearby, I kind of got a weird vibe. Could be just all the history of the place, but it could also be something else. But it's one of those things that, like, you get a weird vibe about the place. And while the Stanley Hotel is up in the mountains. It's not super isolated like its cinematic counterpart. So they had to be very creative with the camera angles, which, having visited both the Elm Street house and the Doyle house stand-ins up in LA, and seeing how they actually are situated in the town, I do get a better appreciation and understanding of how they can do stuff like this. You just gotta use certain lenses, angle the shots well, and you can hide stuff like that. Especially here, they didn't need to show Estes Park, Colorado, and it worked. Now, my overall thoughts on the miniseries, which I'm doing this before even going back to revisit it. It's been about a decade since I watched it, and the last time I watched it was the first time I actually watched it all the way straight through in one sitting. Because before then I had watched it all the way through, but in bits and pieces due to my 2 years of cinema as literature. I remember liking it okay, but being like, yeah, it's a little too long. And that's really probably my main complaint with it. That there's no reason this is should be a three-part miniseries. And here's my main reason why. The book version of The Shining is about 400-ish pages, and it's a three-parter. Meanwhile, it is a 1,000-plus page book, and it got a two-part miniseries. Now, with that, there are parts that they really heavily abridge in order to get the story across, and other stuff that you consider fluff that they cut out. But it still tells the job effectively. It's just certain parts of it make a lot more sense when you've read the book prior or when you read the book later. Because that one I saw the miniseries before I read the book and then went back to it and like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. Whereas with this, there's a lot of parts that they stretch out, and other things they cut out stuff like Mr. Ullman, the manager of the hotel. He's in a handful of scenes in the book. You would think if they're going to do a three-parter, they would include a couple of the other scenes, like him and Jack getting into an argument on the phone. I want you out of my hotel. It's not your hotel. Nope. Ullman is only in one scene. And the only positive I can really give about that scene before going back and watching it is that you get his characterization from the book more spot on in that one scene than you do in both scenes that he's in the Kubrick one, because his character is totally changed. The character in the Kubrick film, he's a nice manager, but it's not Mr. Ullman. It is a completely different character. He's Ullman in name only. He's Unio, or however you want to pronounce it. Yeah. And they do stretch out all the other stuff like the wasps, a lot of other stuff they throw in there. And of course they even threw in one thing King did not know about when he was going through his addictions and wrote the book in the first place, and that's AA. Which it's a fluff scene, but it is a nice scene to throw in, and especially coming from somebody whose family has a history of addiction, and I've seen people having to deal with these type of struggles, so it's a nice little scene. Now, if they had put it to two parts, it's also one that I could have seen them editing out. Now, even with my issue about length there, I can admit that some of its award love is justified. Like its outstanding makeup in a miniseries, it definitely deserved that. Sound editing for a miniseries, definitely. Being nominated for Outstanding Miniseries, I could definitely see that. And it winning at the Saturn for Single Genre TV Presentation, and Weber getting for Actor, yeah. Now, with Weber, I think his main issue going into this miniseries is the fact that no matter how good a job he did, he was always going to be unfairly compared to Jack Nicholson, because it's Jack freaking Nicholson. Regardless of how bastardized the character of Jack Torrance was in the Kubrick film, Jack Nicholson did do a pretty good job for what he had, for what direction they went with. Not to say he could have done book accurate Jack Torrance with the right direction, and go from a very nuanced portrayal to what you expect out of Jack in the end when Torrance is going crazy. John Voight, who is King one, probably would have done a better job as Book Torrance. But for what it is, Steven Weber I felt was a pretty good choice for it. He was not the first one apparently, because at another time Gary Sinise was asked, but he turned it down because of the whole So, they're never going to accept anyone but Nicholson in the role type of thing. And they also offered it to his Wings co-star Tim Daly, or Daly, however you pronounce it. And he not only turned the role down, but he also recommended Weber. Now, just from memory, if there's one thing that I could criticize Weber for just from memory, it's that he's not really intimidating in the latter half, but that's more from an audience perspective. It could be one of those things where you got to look at it in two ways. Like, okay, how does it look to me? How does it look to the characters? And it's one of those things that to me, he didn't seem that intimidating. But to the characters in the moment, I can see why. And part of it was there's a couple moments, like when Halloran gets his butt whooped, just the way they presented it, well, aside the fact that he dies in the Kubrick version, they go from him getting killed like that, which is a very suspenseful scene, and replacing the axe with the roque mallet like in the book, and in this miniseries, it's a surprise attack and he got knocked the fuck out, as Smokey would say. It's him coming out of the elevator going, "You just initiated your own beating, come on down!" That was a moment like a light chuckle, but yeah, kind of bad for pacing. But I'll say Rebecca is definitely a better casting for Winifred, just from a look standpoint, than Shelley Duvall, although I don't mind Shelley's performance in that film, not bringing in any of the behind-the-scenes fiasco stuff she had to deal with from Kubrick. Cortland, kind of a weak point when it comes to Daniel, from what I remember. I don't hate him, but I could see why he gets on people. I mean, he just previously played in The Little Rascals. That's the only other live-action thing I can remember him from. Oh yeah, he was also in Tom and Huck. Small role. Of course, Melvin Van Peebles, it's Melvin Van Peebles. I mean, you can't really get anyone more perfect for him in the miniseries other than the person who played him previously, Scatman Crothers. So. And of course, Pat Hingle, it's Pat Hingle. Don't you dare disrespect Commissioner Gordon that way, or I will pimp slap you. And there's not really much else to say about this miniseries to set the tone, other than a little interesting fact for my fellow constant readers that they're probably thinking just from the fact I'm bringing up when this film was made. And that is that when he was heading home from the set of finishing this film, or them doing something with the film when he was no longer needed for that moment, and he was driving home, King got an inkling that it was time to resume writing on another project. That project, of course, being what many consider his magnum opus, which is the Dark Tower series. And from that, he began writing what, of course, was the fourth book, Wizard and Glass. And that one, it's mainly because of the fact that one deals with teenage love. But that one, I don't need to drag it into this. I just thought that was an interesting fact. Well, that's really all to say here. So next time you see me come up with Shining Above It, we will be delving into the first episode. So this should be a little interesting little series with this. And hopefully for the next couple Stephen King miniseries, we'll be able to do it the same way. I don't know if I have much to say about them as I did with this one, but till then, and see you next time with episode 1.